The rain fell in a steady, almost respectful rhythm over the ruined city, as if the sky itself mourned the bones of what once stood here. It was not the wild, cleansing rain of spring, but a cold, thin drizzle that carried the smell of smoke and rust. Droplets slid down the blackened shells of buildings, following cracks like tears tracing scars. The streets were silent now, save for the occasional groan of a wall finally surrendering to gravity, or the distant clatter of loosened masonry falling into flooded gutters. Somewhere, far away, a fire still hissed under the touch of the rain, stubbornly clinging to its last embers. Smoke hung low in the air, so dense in places that it blurred the outlines of the ruined architecture, as though the city itself was trying to hide its disfigurement. Captain Elias Marlow moved carefully through the devastation, each step sinking slightly into the sodden mud that used to be cobblestones. His boots squelched, leaving behind prints that would be washed away within minutes. He stepped over the twisted wreckage of a bicycle, its frame bent and rusting, the front wheel still faintly spinning in the breeze. Then he saw it, a picture frame, lying face down in a shallow puddle. Elias crouched and lifted it, brushing the wet grit away from the glass. Inside, behind a fine crack that split the image in two, was the frozen smile of a family: father, mother, 2 children. The father's uniform suggested a baker, the mother's dress plain but neat. The children grinned, as if the world could never touch them. Elias lingered on their faces longer than he should have. Carefully, almost ceremoniously, he placed the frame on the sill of a shattered window above. It wouldn't last. The rain would get to it eventually, but some stubborn part of him wanted it to stand a little longer against the tide of destruction. The weight of his rifle seemed heavier than usual, not from its steel and wood, but from the knowledge of what it might yet be called upon to do. The war had been dragging its claws across the world for 4 years. For bitter winters of frostbitten marches and frozen rations. For summers where fields ripened only to be trampled into mud, where gold wheat stalks were replaced by the red of spilled blood. Now finally it was ending. Not with a grand speech or triumphant music, but with the slow collapse of exhausted armies, the weary laying down of arms, and the brittle hope that there might be something left to rebuild. If there was a victory, it was a fragile, uncertain one. Elias's unit had been ordered to sweep the northern quarter for stragglers, enemy soldiers either too stubborn, too lost, or too broken to surrender. The order sounded simple on paper, but in the skeletal remains of the city, every shadow could hide a rifle barrel, and every building was a potential tomb. Behind him, 6 men followed in loose formation. They were young, though war had stolen the softness from their faces. Pale beneath the grime, eyes dulled by sleepless nights, they moved with a kind of mechanical obedience. No one spoke. The air here seemed to swallow voices. Words felt too loud, too alive for such a place. They passed a shop with its front blown open, its wares scattered and waterlogged. Glass crunched under Elias's boot as he glanced inside. Dresses hung on headless mannequins, the fabric darkened by soot. In the corner, a child's wooden toy lay overturned, one wheel missing. The scene was almost peaceful, except for the dark, dried shape in the doorway, where someone had fallen long ago. Elias kept walking. The further they went, the thicker the fog of smoke became. Somewhere nearby, a building had burned for days before the rain had reached it. The charred timbers jutted from the rubble like blackened ribs. Elias could hear the faint drip of water leaking from a fractured rooftop into a puddle below, a slow, metronomic beat that matched the pace of their steps. At an intersection, Elias raised his hand. The men froze instantly. He peered into the shadowed arch of a stone alley, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a figure slipping deeper inside. He signaled to 2 soldiers, who peeled away to check the alley, rifles ready. The silence that followed was tight and waiting, like a held breath. A minute later, they reappeared, shaking their heads. Just wind and shadows. Still, Elias felt the tension in his shoulders refuse to leave. The city was like that, always holding its secrets, always whispering of danger just around the next corner. He had learned long ago to trust those whispers. The rain thickened, tapping against their helmets in a muted rhythm. Elias pulled his collar higher, trying to shield his neck from the cold trickle running down his spine. His gloves were wet through, and the rifle's grip felt slick in his hands. He forced himself to focus, scanning each doorway, each upper floor for a glint of movement. Somewhere above, a shutter creaked in the wind, swinging slowly back and forth. The sound was unnervingly human, like a soft groan. A flock of crows burst suddenly from the roof of a nearby building, their wings slicing through the rain as they vanished into the mist. They crossed a narrow bridge over what used to be a canal. The water below was black with ash and oil, broken beams floating in slow circles. A single helmet drifted past, face down, its chin strap swaying with the current. One of Elias's men muttered something under his breath and made the sign of the cross. No one else spoke. On the far side of the bridge, the road widened into a small square. Once, Elias thought it might have been a marketplace. Now it was an open graveyard of shattered carts and stone. A church stood at the far end, its steeple split and leaning at an unnatural angle. The great wooden doors hung open, one barely attached to its hinges. Inside, he could just make out the dim outline of the altar, lit by the pale gray light filtering through holes in the roof. Elias hesitated. He knew the church could hide enemies. The acoustics made every sound deceptive. But he also knew civilians sometimes sought shelter inside. His orders were clear: search everything. He stepped forward. The moment his boot touched the threshold, the air seemed to change, heavier, colder, as though the rain's noise had been left outside. The floor was littered with debris, and the scent of burned wood lingered. Several benches were overturned, their splintered edges pointing toward the altar like accusing fingers. At the far end, beneath a hole in the roof where the rain fell straight onto the stone, stood a small table. On it rested something unexpected, a row of unlit candles, untouched by the chaos around them. Beside them, a single book lay closed, its leather cover worn smooth. Elias approached slowly. He didn't touch the book, but the sight of it stirred something inside him, a reminder that before this war, people had gathered here for reasons beyond survival. When he turned back toward the square, his men were waiting, eyes scanning the mist. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle and gave the signal to move on. The rain followed them, steady and unyielding, washing the city, but never cleansing it. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled, rolling low across the broken skyline. And Elias kept walking, through streets where silence weighed heavier than any enemy's bullet. They reached the building at the corner of a street that looked as though it had been chewed apart by time and violence. The sign above the doorway still bore the faint outline of painted letters, "Post Office," though the paint was flaking and a shell fragment had gouged a deep scar across the wood. The roof sagged under the weight of rainwater, one side having already caved in, leaving a jagged gap that exposed the skeletal beams beneath. The air here was different, thick with a mingled sense of wet plaster, rotting wood, and something subtler, the faint sweetness of decaying paper. Elias stopped at the threshold, his eyes sweeping over the blackened doorway. He raised a hand and gestured silently for Corporal Henley and Private Rourke to circle around to the rear entrance. Their boots splashed in the puddles as they moved off, disappearing into the mist. Elias stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the sound, the quiet dripping of water falling from somewhere above, echoing in the hollow space. The second thing was the smell. The mold was strong here, clinging to the walls, and underneath it, the scent of ink and damp parchment. Rows of tall mailboxes lined one wall, their brass handles tarnished and green with age. Some stood tightly shut, locked against a past that would never return. Others hung open like broken jaws, their contents spilled across the floor in dark, pulpy heaps. Parcels lay collapsed where string had rotted away. Letters, once crisp, had fused together in sodden lumps, the ink bled into unreadable shadows. Elias's boots left faint marks in the damp dust as he moved deeper. He passed a counter where civilians must once have queued, their chatter filling the air with ordinary concerns: bills, birthdays, love letters, and news from sons at the front. That front was everywhere now, and those voices were gone. Near the center of the floor, something caught his eye. It was a single envelope, lying atop a pile of ruined papers. It stood out not because of its size or shape, but because it was whole. The paper was untouched by damp, the edges sharp and the surface free of stains. The rain had not reached it, as if the building itself had been guarding it for this moment. He crouched down, gloved fingers brushing away a shred of debris before picking it up. The texture was firm beneath his touch, a survivor among casualties. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, almost old-fashioned in its elegance. To Private Daniel Firth, 3rd Battalion, if found, please deliver. Beneath the address, in the top right corner, a date. 2 years ago. Elias turned the envelope over, tracing the unbroken seal with his thumb. The war had moved like a storm in those years, fronts collapsing, regiments scattered, men transferred without warning. Some were swallowed whole by the fighting, their names never making it back to headquarters. He searched his memory, but the name Firth stirred nothing. He thought about the possibilities. Perhaps Firth had died before the letter ever reached him. Perhaps he was lying in a hospital bed, unrecognizable even to those who once knew him. Or maybe, by some chance, he was still somewhere out there, carrying on with his part of the fight, unaware that a piece of his past had been waiting here all this time. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just paper but all the weight of the years between when it was written and now. In war, the smallest things often mattered more than the largest victories: a photograph, a locket, a letter. They were the anchors that kept men tethered to a world beyond mud and blood. Elias slid the letter into the inside pocket of his coat. It would stay there until he found Firth, or until he knew he never would. Either way, it would not be left behind. Behind him, the sound of boots squelching in wet ash drew closer. Henley appeared in the doorway, shaking his head. Rears clear. Nothing moving. His voice was low, almost respectful, as if speaking too loudly here might disturb something. Elias gave a short nod. We move on. But keep your eyes open. This place. He glanced once more at the rows of mailboxes, each one a silent monument to messages that would never be read. It's full of ghosts. As they stepped back into the rain, Elias felt the envelope shift against his chest with each movement. He imagined the journey it had taken, written in some warm kitchen or candlelit room, sealed with care, passed into the hands of a postman who might have believed it would reach its destination in days. Then the war came, and the letter was swept up in the chaos, its path interrupted by artillery shells, advancing armies, and the slow ruin of the city. He wondered who had written it. A mother? A sister? A sweetheart? Whoever it was, they had chosen their words carefully, believing they would be read by the person they loved. Elias did not need to read it to know it mattered. The not knowing was its own kind of truth. The rain greeted them again as they emerged onto the street, the city's silence settling around them once more. Elias adjusted the strap of his rifle, but his thoughts stayed on the small, dry envelope hidden inside his coat, a fragile reminder that even here, in the hollowed-out heart of a dying war, there were still things worth carrying. Back at camp that night, Elias pulled his coat tighter around him and sat near the dim glow of a stove. His second-in-command, Sergeant Rook, noticed the envelope. "You thinking of reading it?" Rook asked. His voice was half teasing, half serious. "It's not mine," Elias replied. "Nothing's anyone's anymore," Rook muttered, staring into the fire. Elias tucked the letter into his breast pocket. He didn't want to open it. Somehow, he felt it wasn't his place, and maybe if he found Firth, giving it to him sealed would be a rare gift in a war that stole everything. The next days were a blur of movement through ruined neighborhoods. Some civilians had returned, scavenging what they could. Others stood and stared at the remnants of their homes, unable to move. Occasionally, a lone shot rang out in the distance, reminders that the war's end wasn't total. One afternoon, as the sun bled weakly through a gap in the clouds, Elias's unit found an abandoned enemy trench line. Inside one dugout, huddled in a corner, was a man in a torn uniform, his leg wrapped in dirty bandages. He raised his hands slowly. "Don't shoot," he said in accented English. "Please." The man was barely more than a boy. Elias ordered him disarmed and given water. It wasn't mercy, just necessity. They needed information, and killing prisoners wasn't something Elias allowed unless there was no choice. As the boy drank, Elias noticed him staring at the envelope in his pocket. "That's British?" the boy asked softly. Elias narrowed his eyes. "How would you know?" The boy hesitated, then said, "I carried letters once. Before the war. I know the way they look." He smiled faintly, then looked away, as if remembering something too painful to speak aloud. 2 days later, Elias finally found someone who knew Firth's name. It was Corporal Stanton, an old comrade stationed in a forward medical camp. "Firth," Stanton said, shaking his head. "He's here, but you won't get a conversation out of him. Got hit in the head during the spring offensive. Doesn't talk much now. Just sits." Elias followed him into a large tent. Rows of wounded soldiers lay on cots, some staring into space, others sleeping fitfully. At the far end, a man with a gaunt face and blank eyes sat upright, staring at nothing. "That's him," Stanton whispered. Elias approached slowly. "Private Firth." No reaction. He crouched down, lowering his voice. "I have something for you." He held out the envelope. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Firth blinked, a small, almost imperceptible change. His gaze dropped to the envelope, and his fingers twitched. Elias placed it in his hands. Firth's movements were slow, deliberate. He slid a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased but dry. His eyes scanned the words, and his breathing changed. His lips trembled. Without warning, tears welled and spilled down his cheeks. His shoulders shook. The letter slipped from his grasp, falling face up onto the blanket. Elias saw only a few lines before he looked away out of respect. "Danny, if you're reading this, it means you made it through another day." Firth clutched the paper to his chest and whispered something Elias couldn't hear. For the first time since the war had swallowed him, Private Daniel Firth was alive in more than just body. That night, Elias lay awake listening to the rain on the canvas. He thought about the hundreds, thousands of letters that had never reached their destinations. Words meant for lovers, mothers, friends. Words that could have given a moment of light in so much darkness. The war would end soon. But not all battles were fought with bullets. Sometimes, the hardest ones were about holding on to humanity when everything around you was determined to take it away. In the morning, Elias would lead his men to the next sector. But the letter stayed with Firth, tucked safely in his hand. And Elias carried something, too. The quiet knowledge that in a world built on orders and destruction, a single piece of paper had been enough to change the way one man faced the end of the war. And maybe, just maybe, that was victory enough.